It's great to see all of you here this morning, despite the weather outside. We had such a beautiful day yesterday, and unfortunately, we're not having such a great day today. And hopefully, the weekend will be a little better. But for today, it's great to see all of you here this morning. My name is Bonnie Jenkins. I am a senior non-resident fellow here at the Brookings Institution in the Foreign Policy Program, and I am also the founder and executive director of an organization called Women of Color Advancing Peace, Security, and Conflict Transformation. I want to thank Brookings for co-hosting this event with WCAPS. This is actually the second event on redefining national security that WCAPS is doing with Brookings Institution. WCAPS's vision is to advance the leadership and professional development of women of color in the fields of international peace, security, and conflict transformation. At WCAPS, we believe global issues demand a variety of perspectives. A space is needed that is devoted to women of color, that cultivates a strong voice and network for its members, while promoting dialogue and strategies for engaging in policy discussions on an international scale. Redefining national security is a theme within the WCAPS mission that helps to promote the underlying approach of our work. The reason why this theme has been chosen is that we all face global threats that seem to be increasing in reach. And we find that these threats are challenging to our national security and are not in the category of traditional military or hard security issues. It is difficult to argue that global concerns such as climate change, infectious disease, challenges to our oceans and to food and water security are not impacting the lives and well-being of U.S. citizens and will do so increasingly in the future. This leads to the recognition that as a country, we need to be in a better process, have a better process of making connections between domestic and international concerns, since these global challenges affect everyone around the world, including Americans. And as in most areas of peace and security, the ramifications of these threats will be more harmful to women and predominantly to women of color here and around the world. So we at WCAPS want to continue to provide a space for dialogue on global challenges that affect the U.S. and our national security particularly. And how we address such issues raises the question also of how these concerns are reflected in our decision-making on who will be our leaders to decide how the U.S. will combat these threats. In the lead up to this event, I did a small survey to find out how people define national security in 2019. Most responses did center on the need to focus on both traditional and non-traditional approaches. For example, one person said, quote, "National security is the protection of the nation from both domestic and foreign threats. While it includes having an adequate armed force, it should also hold a strong focus on protection of the nation's citizens. For example, working against having a police state, making sure all citizens have adequate food and water, protecting our environment, and working against domestic terrorism." Another person stated, quote, "At its broadest level, national security is the ability to secure life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all members of our country, regardless of their station in our society." And finally, one other person said that there are three main components to national security. One is internal integrity, such as free and fair elections, free media, civilian control of a stable military, plus vibrant engagement by citizens that confirm the nation's social contract survives and thrives. Secondly, relationship integrity, such as collaborative involvement in social, economic, and other agreements with other state actors. And third, it includes issue involvement, such as focusing on the key global, regional, and local issues from human-caused climate change, trade, immigration, and a healthy environment. This morning's discussions will touch on these themes. The discussions will focus on how we define national security, how that definition does or does not recognize the interrelationship between international and domestic threats, and what connections we should draw that educate us on how we vote in leaders who will help define national security and therefore our policies on how we address U.S. and global challenges. I invite all of you to learn more about WCAPS and visit our website on WCAPS.org and help us as we promote a vision for a more equitable, diverse, and inclusive peace, security, and foreign policy process. And with that, I'd like to welcome our first speaker today to the stage, Mr. Arslan Suleiman. Good morning, Arslan. How are you?
Good morning. Thank you, Ambassador.
I think what we'd like to do first is allow you to introduce yourself and say a little bit about what you do and what you've been working on in the past couple of years.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks to you and WCAPS and the Brookings Institution for organizing this really great discussion that I'm very happy and proud to be a part of. Well, I used to be part of the Obama administration in the State Department, where I was working in a couple of capacities. I was working as the Deputy Special Envoy to the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, then in the last 2 years, the acting U.S. Special Envoy to the OIC. And I also spent some time in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, where I was a counselor for multilateral affairs there, advising on U.S. human rights policy in the UN system. But since the end of the administration, I've gone back to practicing law. So I'm at the law firm Foley Hoek LLP. I'm also a non-resident fellow at the Georgetown Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. I was a graduate of the school, so I'm really happy to be back there with the Institute. And I've also co-founded an organization called America Indivisible. America Indivisible is a nonprofit, nonpartisan coalition organization focused on combating anti-Muslim bigotry by emphasizing the American values of unity, inclusion, and pluralism. And we have a coalition of about 20 organizations, including American Muslim organizations, Sikh American organizations. We have veterans groups like Veterans for American Ideals. We have interfaith groups like the Shoulder to Shoulder Coalition. So it's a broad diversity of organizations, all of which are organized around one particular goal that we're trying to focus on, which is increasing the number of Americans who know their fellow Muslim Americans, their neighbors, colleagues. And the goal behind increasing that knowledge, that awareness, is that many studies have indicated that when people know people from different groups, they are much more likely to associate other people from that group with positive values than with negative values. And unfortunately, a lot of the polling data indicates that upwards of half of Americans have claimed not to know Muslims. And that lack of personal knowledge, we believe, our coalition believes, is a really key element of anti-Muslim bigotry that we've been seeing in the country. And so as a coalition, we are working to, again, increase that number and percentage of Americans who know their fellow Muslim Americans. And we're doing that in various ways. One way that we're doing it is by focusing on local elected officials. So we're working closely with mayors, governors, city council members across the country to try to help them and their local Muslim communities establish sustained dialogues. When I say local Muslim communities, I'm also actually talking a little bit broader because, as you heard, our coalition includes other groups, Sikhs, South Asian Americans, Arab Americans. So our coalition is broader in the sense that it's including people who are often perceived to be Muslim. Because unfortunately, we've seen many hate crimes that are targeting Sikh Americans or Indian Americans. The motivation behind those attacks are often related to anti-Muslim bigotry, but they end up affecting people who aren't actually Muslim and just are perceived to be Muslim. So our work focuses on having or fostering sustained dialogues between local communities and their elected officials. And one of the initiatives that we're launching this year is called the Public Leaders for Inclusion Council, which will bring a cohort of about 25 local government officials from around the country working in local and municipal government to have a sustained leadership training program where they receive a 6-week-long course in leadership training, and it concludes with the summit here in DC. So we're really excited about that type of work. But another area of our work also is to develop toolkits to give local communities and government officials the tools that they need to do this work on their own. So a big part of our operating principle, we're a very lean organization, is to really leverage our coalition partners and to try to leverage grassroots communities who are really interested in doing this work.
That's great. I'm actually very familiar with your organization, and we're going to be partnering with you on some activities, so I look forward to that.
We're really excited about that. Thank you.
So I wonder if you could say a little bit about some of the things that you did at your time while you were at State Department, because I want to connect it to some of these issues of domestic and international concerns. So why don't you say a little bit about what you did there, and then we can talk about some of these international, domestic, global threats.
Sure, absolutely. So the role that I had in the State Department that related to the Special Envoy's office, the U.S. Special Envoy to the OIC, that role for the Obama administration was particularly defined by pursuing the policies that the president had set out in his 2009 Cairo speech. Not to be confused with Secretary Pompeo's Cairo speech, which apparently was groundbreaking, but President Obama's 2009 Cairo speech, which really set forward a new vision for the United States' engagement with Muslim communities around the world, as well as Muslim majority countries. Because unfortunately, in the past, and I think it's very clear that in the present as well, our relationship with many Muslim majority countries and communities globally is securitized. It's seen through the lens of counterterrorism and counter-extremism, or whatever terminology is being used. And that lens distorts our policy. It distorts, frankly, the pursuit of our national interests. And one of the goals that we were pursuing in the OIC Envoy's office was to expand the scope of our cooperation and collaboration with the OIC member countries, and also Muslim communities more broadly within OIC member countries. And that entailed a broadening of the conversation. So sure, we were addressing issues related to counterterrorism and cooperation on counter-extremism. That is absolutely an important element of foreign policy, but that's not the only element. We also tried to directly address head-on political concerns that these communities had about U.S. foreign policies. So that related to issues about the U.S. invasion of Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, the use of drone strikes in various parts of the world, including in areas where we don't have active military operations. It included discussing policies related to the Middle East and U.S. support for certain regimes in the Middle East, as well as U.S. policy on Israel and Palestine. So there was a broadening of that conversation, both with officials, but in particular with the publics. And there was a broadening of the scope of our focus on engagement. So we tried to foster partnerships in areas where there was mutual interest and mutual trust. And so we were able to help expand collaboration on health issues like polio eradication efforts and maternal and child health programs. We also made an effort to increase the number of OIC countries in the Global Health Security Initiative. We were expanding humanitarian cooperation because the OIC has a network of NGOs that is active in areas where, frankly, American NGOs don't have great reach. So that include countries like Somalia and Yemen. And because of that collaboration, we were able to expand the reach of some of U.S. Humanitarian efforts, but also in collaboration, broader UN coordinated relief efforts. We also worked on human rights issues, so that was very much on the agenda as well. So that included issues of women's rights and women's empowerment. And within that sub-basket of groups, we worked with the OIC and member countries on initiatives like providing support for women in STEM fields. We had a program where we had dozens of women scientists from OIC member countries who received funding to come to the United States for leadership development training programs. We also worked with the OIC on combating female genital mutilation. And in 2016, in fact, the OIC as an organization took a position that called on all of its member states to ban the practice throughout all of its member states. and we confronted head-on issues related to religious freedom and the treatment of religious minorities. So for a long time, the OIC had been sponsoring within the United Nations efforts to ban speech related to what was defined as speech that was blasphemous or insulting to religion or religious figures. And that type of framework or view of speech, unfortunately, is present in many countries where there are blasphemy laws and there are speech restrictions that target treatment or language directed at religions or religious figures. And unfortunately, those laws are often used to target religious minorities and political dissidents. And we worked with the OIC on getting that issue out of the UN. With that work, as of 2011, that resolution that they had been sponsoring, the Defamation of Religions resolution, is no longer in the UN. Instead, there was a replacement resolution that focused on specific concrete steps that governments and society can take to combat discrimination on the basis of religion. And that included steps like having leaders speak out and condemn instances of hate crimes or anti-religious speech. It talked about education programs. It talked about engaging with communities. A lot of the initiatives and policies that traditionally we've seen in the United States, I say traditionally purposefully because a lot of those actions aren't present or salient today, but a lot of the steps that are traditionally associated with the U.S. response to hate speech and hate crimes were memorialized in that resolution and were encouraged globally. So that's a little bit of an example of sort of the scope of issues that we were dealing with in that office specifically.
Great, and I was not aware of all those things that you. I knew some of it, but I wasn't aware of that much. So that's really great to hear about what you were doing, and you've already touched on it a bit about some of the things that you did. I mean, you talk about what you're doing here now in the U.S. with your organization, and the thing that you were doing when you were at State Department on the international scale. So, what are some of the things that you would say about the way in which international issues are connected to domestic issues? Some of these issues you're talking about in terms of, religious freedom or women empowerment or some of the human rights issues you're addressing overall. What are the connections that you see, and what do we lose when we don't make those connections?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there was an old saying in the U.S. that politics stop at the water's edge. But tweets certainly don't, nor does Facebook Live. And if that old saying ever had an ounce of truth, I think we've definitely seen that basically obliterated recently and in recent years. And I think in part that's because of the reality of global integration. First of all, things that are said here are instantaneously broadcast globally, and people can see discussions that are happening here. They can see this discussion right now, if they so choose. So the politics that we are engaging in here affect the politics and dialogue and discourse and discussions that other societies are having globally. But in addition to that, the reality of integration has also played a role in shaping our discourse on what were traditionally seen as domestic issues. So, the old saying from the Clinton years of "is the economy stupid?" If you think about it now, the discourse about the economy here, in particular since the 2016 election, is focused on trade and how other countries are apparently taking advantage of us in trade agreements, and about immigration, how the open, quote-unquote open borders that we've had has contributed to the loss of jobs in certain parts of the country. I'm not trying to imply that those arguments or topics have, no factual basis to them, but my point is simply that these issues that have traditionally been seen as foreign policy-related issues, trade, immigration, are very central now to the conversation of issues like the economy, and the conversations that have been shaped by in particular by 2016 elections, but I think more broadly, we've seen how that affects global dialogue on those issues. So you mentioned religious tolerance. The rise in hate crimes in the United States that have targeted minority groups, including religious minority groups such as Jews and Muslims, is a topic and an issue that is very well read and covered and discussed internationally. And unfortunately, we've seen the interplay between the rise of right-wing and white nationalist or white supremacist groups in the United States having an impact on the rise of such groups abroad in Europe and elsewhere. And there's a symbiotic relationship to them because there's a shared ideology. But what has traditionally been seen as sort of a domestic, people are more and more calling it domestic terrorism now, but it was seen as sort of a small domestic threat, and the president has continued to describe it as such. I think the reality of that now, and more people are realizing it, is that these groups represent a real transnational terrorist threat. The ideology is shared, and unfortunately the ideology, in particular in the past few years, has been getting more oxygen. It's been getting more sustenance and support from people in elected office, including arguably this administration, but in particular as well in Europe. If you look, there are a number of right-wing political parties that have campaigned on platforms that are in particular focused on anti-immigration issues, but those parties have very clear and disturbing links with anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim sentiment and Islamophobia. So the issues that we have domestically related to racism and white supremacist and nationalist groups, we've always had that. It's never gone away, and there's always been a relationship between those groups and things happening abroad, but I think we're more aware of it now, and I think the ties and connectivity between them are being more widely covered and discussed. So I definitely think that, you know, these issues are certainly, while they are important key domestic issues, but they're also very much tied into foreign policy issues. And you mentioned issues related to human rights. This gets into that as well. And it gets into the point that I was sort of getting at before, which is in the past, the United States was seen globally as a moral voice for human rights. And our progress on civil rights was a point of pride, that we could look to other countries internationally and say, we have problems, we continue to work on those problems, but we've come a long way. And I think the narrative on those issues and on human rights issues now is very different. You don't see this administration talking about human rights. You don't see in any readout you get from a meeting with a foreign official any line at all that mentions human rights being discussed or raised at all. In fact, instead, the position of the government has been that if human rights are raised, it's a private matter and it's not linked directly to our national interest, according to Secretary Tillerson, and I don't think that policy has changed at all. And the rhetoric of targeting minority groups, of divisiveness in our politics, has really tarnished our image abroad as a leader on human rights issues, and that has given license to other countries to take actions that you wouldn't have predicted that they would have taken had America been more assertive in making human rights issues more central to our foreign policy and raising those issues directly. So you can look at the panoply of issues, but I'm talking in particular about the treatment of the Uyghur minority in China, the issue of the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, the rise in violence against religious minority groups in India, the treatment of various religious minorities in Europe. Instead of raising concerns about these developments and these trends internationally, unfortunately, this administration has instead continued to politicize minorities and immigration and continue to target groups for rhetoric that has helped lead to a rise in hate crimes. And we've seen that documented. If you look at the FBI statistics for hate crimes, they've been going up over the past 3 to 4 years. Last year there was a jump, I believe, of about 35% in terms of anti-Semitic hate crimes. If you look at the trend over the past 2 or 3 years, anti-Muslim hate crimes have been on the rise. The Southern Poverty Law Center has documented over the past 3 years that there have been a more than doubling of anti-Muslim hate groups in the United States. So this is a real trend. There are real facts behind it. The government is not doing enough rhetorically and in terms of leadership on it. And there is a direct relationship between these developments and developments internationally that are being either ignored or not directly handled in an effective way.
Great, thank you. So what we're going to do now is, I think Arslan has been able to provide us a background for our two panels that we're going to be having. And so we're going to save, I guess we have time maybe for one question, if anyone has any. But we wanted this to be kind of the background for starting our conversation in the next two panels. So unless, if we can hold off any questions and maybe, start addressing them as we go through the next panels, that would be great. But before we do, I want to thank Arslan Suleiman for taking time to be with us. And your organization's doing great work here in the U.S. and looking forward to working with you. And with that, I want to welcome our first panel to the stage. That's going to be moderated by my colleague, Michael Hanlon at Brookings, the Foreign Policy Program.
Thank you so much, Bonnie.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.